Welcome to this video lecture on the role of minimum wage for fair wages. People are not potatoes. Well, potatoes don't suffer whether they sell cheap or expensive. Workers need to earn a wage they can live on, independently of supply and demand. That is why, by adopting the ILO Constitution, countries agree that labor is not a commodity. Wages are too important to be left to the free market. In absence of strong wage-setting institutions, the market may result in poverty, wages, and inequality. Research shows that low union density, company-level negotiations, low level of wage coordination, no extension mechanisms, lack of statutory minimum wage or very low minimum wages lead to extremely low wages, poverty, and inequality. It is important to emphasize here that poverty has an absolute and a relative dimension. The absolute minimum is about the very basic needs for food, shelter, and health. But a living minimum wage should enable people to participate as equal citizens in society. A living minimum wage is also critical to addressing inequality and stabilizing the economy. While individual employers only see the higher costs of paying their workers more, they tend to ignore the positive effect higher wages can have on the demands for goods and services and on economic growth more generally. Let us hear from the macroeconomics professor Hansjörg Herr on this.
Lower-income households spend a higher percentage of their income than high-income households. A millionaire can live in the lap of luxury and at the same time save a high percentage of her or his income. A poor household may spend its complete income. This leads us to the conclusion that economies with high inequality have lack of aggregate demand. Increasing profit shares over recent decades have led to higher inequality, as a higher proportion of national income flows to rich or super-rich households, which tend to spend a smaller share of their total income on consumption. A high percentage of profits goes into savings. High inequality leads to a lack of expenditure on education, health, and in general maintaining the working population. Inequality is highly correlated not only with education or health, but also with many other negative social indicators. Last but not least, inequality contributes to political instability and social unrest, which makes stable economic development almost impossible. The International Monetary Fund found that it is relatively easy to trigger a growth process, but it is difficult to sustain it. One of the preconditions for long and stable growth with high employment creation is a relatively equal income distribution. There is a real danger that after decades of increasing inequality, developed countries may enter a long period of low growth.
Most countries in the world have minimum wages. However, it is often the case that it is at a level that does not allow for a decent living. According to the ILO's expert on wages, Belser, key questions need to be considered in determining meaningful minimum wages.
If set too low, minimum wages will have little effect in protecting workers and their families against low pay or poverty. If they are set too high, they will be poorly complied with and may have adverse employment effects. To be meaningful, minimum wages have to be set at a level that covers the income needs of workers and their families. These needs can be estimated in several ways. One approach is to estimate the average cost of basic needs by adding up the cost of food, housing, other essential expenses like health, education, and the participation in the social life of the community. This is the approach usually taken in estimating living wages. Another approach is to define needs as some proportion, like 60% for example, of median household income. This is done, for example, to estimate relative poverty lines and is intended to capture the costs of social inclusion and equal opportunity in a particular country at a particular time.
Let us also look at the criteria that minimum wages have to meet to address issues of inequality.
To reduce inequality, minimum wages must meet 3 criteria. First, the minimum wage regime must raise wages for low-wage, formal and informal sector workers at a faster rate than wage increases of higher wage earners. Second, negative employment impacts or increased informality must not negate wage gains. Third, wide coverage of low-wage earners is important.
There are also other considerations to be taken into account in calculating the minimum wage. For example, does a country provide free health care, or do workers need to buy health insurance? Do low-paid workers have access to social housing or housing allowances? Or are poor people entitled to buy subsidized food? Another critical consideration is that minimum wages cannot be defined without the required working hours. Let's stop for a moment here to discuss the implications of different bases for calculating the minimum wage, whether hourly, daily, or monthly.
An hourly wage can improve compliance because it is easy to remember and straightforward to enforce. It also ensures that workers are paid for every hour worked. However, it does not guarantee workers a minimum wage over a longer period of time. This is particularly harmful in sectors where casual or seasonal work is common. If minimum wages are set on a daily or monthly basis rather than an hourly basis, this is to ensure that workers are not forced to work overtime without additional pay. For example, if the minimum wage applies to a 40-hour work week and the worker works 50 hours, they must earn above the minimum wage.
The process of setting and adjusting the level is perhaps the most challenging part of minimum wage fixing. There are, of course, different interests in society and also competing economic theories about the impact of minimum wages on economic growth and employment. Although there is no magic formula here, the ILO's expert on wages argues that 3 things are needed.
The first one is social dialogue. When it comes to minimum wage fixing, social dialogue is the best way to find the right number. There is usually little ownership and less compliance when governments decide unilaterally. The second one is an evidence-based approach, with adequate statistics and studies and also a good monitoring system. Social dialogue should be based on timely and realistic numbers. The third piece is a balanced set of criteria for determining the level, taking into account, on the one hand, the needs of workers and their families, and on the other, economic factors.
A number of indicators can be used to inform social dialogue and policy decisions. As discussed earlier by Belser, one is the level of minimum wage compared to the average wage or the median wage, which is the wage in the middle of the distribution. This is sometimes called the Kites ratio. Belser elaborates further on this and other indicators.
In developed economies, the minimum wage is frequently set at somewhere between 40 and 60% of the median wage. In developing countries, the ratio of minimum to median wages is frequently higher, around 70 to 80%, not least because the median wage earner is often relatively low paid. It's a low paid worker. Other useful indicators include the ratio of minimum wages to average wages, or the proportion of workers who are directly affected by a new minimum wage or by a minimum wage increase.
Let's stop for a moment at the question of coverage. Does the minimum wage protect all workers, or at least a large proportion of workers in need of income protection, in particular workers precariously employed? The ILO's expert on these issues, Rani, responds to this question.
Now, if we look at developing and emerging economies, a large proportion of workers are actually engaged as self-employed and unpaid family workers, though there are quite a lot of variations across regions and countries. In contrast, in industrialized countries, majority of the workers are engaged in wage employment and only a very small proportion are engaged as self-employed workers. When we look at national minimum wage laws, we find that in most countries actually these laws also apply to informal wage workers even if they have no written contract. However, in some of the countries, certain provisions of minimum wage legislations are in fact specifically targeted at unskilled and low-paid workers or those in the informal economy, as in the case of India and South Africa. The coverage of informal wage workers by minimum wages does not ensure that all workers would receive them, as we find that non-compliance is quite widespread among informal wage workers. Women are also frequently more likely to be underpaid than men, as are disadvantaged ethnic or social groups such as the so-called scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in India, or the indigenous in Peru, or the Africans or the blacks in South Africa.
Despite the fact that compliance with minimum wage is particularly challenging for workers in the informal economy, the existence of a fair minimum wage has a positive impact on low-paid workers in the informal economy. There are basically two main ways through which a fair minimum wage impacts the informal sector.
First, as wages rise in the formal sector, there's an increased demand for informal sector goods and services. Second, the minimum wage can serve as an indicator of a fair wage in the economy, as well as a tool for increasing the bargaining power of workers. This is known as the lighthouse effect and has been witnessed across Latin America and in other countries such as South Africa, Mali, India, and Turkey. Minimum wages therefore reduce inequality in the informal sector also.
In strengthening coverage and compliance with minimum wages, governments may pursue different strategies. The ILO expert discusses the role of public employment programs, including public works programs and/or employment guarantee schemes.
Wage rates are an important aspect of the design of the public employment programs, since they affect the number of people who volunteer to take part in them, which is basically the labor supply response, and the amount of transfer benefits that participants receive, and ultimately the cost of these programs. In addition, the wage rate set in public employment programs determines the extent to which these programs attract poorer sections of the population and has implications for other economic activities. Such an effect has been observed, for example, in India's National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which was introduced in 200 districts in 2005-06 and further extended actually to the entire country, covering 619 districts in 2009-10. The program seeks to provide a guarantee of up to 100 days of employment per household in the rural areas. All rural households willing to supply labor are required to actually register with the village council, which is also called as a Gram Panchayat, and they are issued with a job card. The program then provides legal employment not only to work on demand but also to be paid minimum wages. Wages under the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme were initially linked to the statutory state-level minimum wages for agricultural labourers and later to the national minimum wage floor. Men and women are paid actually the same wage, which is a significant policy change from earlier employment guarantee schemes that we have observed in India. A positive effect of public employment programs which comply with statutory minimum wages is to promote compliance also in the private sector. This happens because private employers who pay less than the minimum wage risk losing their employees, who will prefer to work in public works program or in employment guarantees.
Setting a minimum wage is a contested terrain. Very often, those in biggest need for income protection are at the same time lacking voice and representation. Neil Coleman explains the strategy pursued by trade unions in South Africa.
We sit with a situation in South Africa where 5.5 million full-time workers are earning wages which puts them and their dependents below the poverty line. And the situation in South Africa was basically that apartheid was based on a system of cheap labor. And 16 years after democracy, we analyzed our labor market and found that this situation not only was continuing, but in some respects was getting worse as we saw casualization, atypical work, and all the problems that come with deregulation of the labor market. We took a decision that we needed to introduce a national minimum wage in order to create a minimum wage floor, which would form the basis for a much better system of regulation of wages and working conditions, and that above the minimum wage floor, we would introduce a system of comprehensive collective bargaining, because many workers, particularly vulnerable workers, currently fall through the cracks in South Africa. So we embarked on a campaign which had many different dimensions. It involved extensive research, very high quality research, which developed the arguments around why a national minimum wage was consistent with a program of improving both living standards, but as well as consistent with dealing with issues of poverty and inequality, and not having the predicted drastic effect on employment, which many conservative economists talked about. And this program of research has been very powerful in assisting our campaign in advancing our arguments in the negotiations. At the same time, we've been out through various forms of communication in the mass media, through pamphlets, through the creation of a popular video, and many other methods to begin to communicate with the public about why a national minimum wage is so important in South Africa. We've also embarked on education programs of the membership of the trade unions, civil society, and other organizations.
The need for minimum wages is not limited to poor countries. In very rich countries too, a huge percentage of workers earn only poverty wages. And as Mary Bellman explains for the United States, the existence of a legal minimum wage does by no means guarantee a living wage.
Workers earning the current federal minimum wage live well below the poverty line in this country of high cost of living and abundant wealth. The real value of the federal minimum wage, $7.25 per hour, is worth about 34% less than it was in 1968. Low-wage industries and jobs are the fastest growing in the U.S. economy, impacting all workers' wages negatively. These industries include retail, hospitality, home care, childcare, agriculture, and administrative support. Workers in these low-paid industries are disproportionately female and people of color. These sectors have very low union density and significant employer resistance. Given this context, workers and labor organizations in the U.S. are pushing to raise wages outside of the traditional collective bargaining framework. Federal legislation to raise the minimum wage is stalled as progressive representatives lack sufficient votes. As union and worker power have declined, elected representatives increasingly represent corporate interests at the expense of society overall. Federal inaction to raise the minimum wage has prompted dozens of campaigns at the local and state level in the past 4 years. These campaigns include cities like Los Angeles, Seattle, San Francisco, states such as California and Minnesota, and industry-specific campaigns to raise wages for home care workers and fast food workers, just to name a few. While U.S. unions have long fought for legislation to benefit the working class, the Fight for 15 and other wage initiatives reflect both the failures of enterprise bargaining and also a new approach to organizing on a large scale. Labor is able to connect with workers historically excluded from collective bargaining. Any individual worker can join the efforts. Young workers have relied heavily on personal networks and social media to promote their cause, and coordinated strikes have been held across the country where low-wage workers walk off the job for a day without the protections of a union. A major question is how unions and workers can sustain these struggles and what new organizational structures might emerge. While labor organizations provide key resources behind the scene, Broad coalitions of community-based, faith, and civil society organizations have been the public face of campaigns to raise wages. These coalitions have built a broad base of support, using messages of fairness, livable wages, and economic justice for women and workers of color. Organizing in the community, rather than individual workplaces where the deck is stacked towards employers, allows workers and organizations to extend their reach and reintroduce unions as a positive force for all working people.
Ensuring that the minimum wage is set at the right level, covers the people in need, and supports employment growth and overall economic development is a complex process. It is at the same time a question of power, willingness to compromise, economic theory, good statistical data, and enforcement. If you want to dive even deeper into the subject, you can learn more by enrolling in our online course on wage policies.